Saturday that Alex Rodriguez and Marc had signed a letter of intent and were negotiating the purchase of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Many of us Wolves fans were overcome with an array of emotions, some positive and some negative. So in this video, I'm going to try and do my best to reflect on the most important factors in this prospective ownership change. I'm going to do my best to not make any overstated, sweeping, massive assessments, as frankly, we just don't know enough yet about how things may change, but I do want to present as much relevant information as possible. Also, I do want to apologize off the top if my audio is a little more echoey than normal. I'm freshly moved into a new apartment, and I'm running around like a madman, hanging up blankets on walls and doors to try to absorb some of the sound, but frankly, this place is just pretty empty right now, so there's not much I can do to avoid the echo, but that'll be back to normal soon, but sorry for this video. One of the most pure positive emotions of this situation is the exit of Glen Taylor, or at least the structuring of his exit. The much maligned Timberwolves owner will continue to have full control of the Wolves for 2 more years so that he can mentor Rodriguez and Lore and help them fully assess the franchise before they completely take over in 2023. Now, it's no secret that Wolves fans have long since soured on Glen Taylor, the breakdown between him and Kevin Garnett being the chief concern for many Wolves fans. The relationship between Minnesota's GOAT and Glen Taylor is so bad that KG still hasn't allowed us to retire his number yet. The fans have clearly taken the side of Kevin Garnett, myself included, and the bad taste of that fallout has affected the light that Wolves fans see Taylor in. The other reason many fans have soured on Taylor is that we suck. Plain and simple. We have been one of the worst teams in the league since Kevin Garnett's exit in 2007. And on top of that, the KG era was pretty poorly handled as well. KG's transcendent talent took us to unbefore-seen heights, but the mismanagement of him and the team around him is well documented. And 14 years is a pretty long time to not be able to recover from trading Kevin Garnett. And after this long in turmoil in any situation, near universally fingers get pointed at ownership. Heck, it's the only part of the team that hasn't changed since then, and we still suck. Now, I will briefly rep for Glen Taylor, however, because at the time of him purchasing the Minnesota Timberwolves in 1994, when he did so, he saved the Wolves from being relocated to New Orleans. Relocation is certainly something that we're going to have to address in this video, and I'll get into it more later, but purely looking towards the past, Glen Taylor kept the Wolves in Minnesota, and his clear commitment to Minnesota is something that should be admired and appreciated by Wolves fans, because otherwise we wouldn't have even had a Kevin Garnett era to look back on. So in that regard, I have to tip my hat to him. Now let's talk Alex Rodriguez and Marc Lore. Frankly, I don't know much about Marc Lore. All I know is he's a businessman who helped Walmart compete digitally with Amazon and got their e-commerce department up to date. How that translates to sports ownership is frankly unclear, and it's a lot easier to draw some level of comparison to sports ownership with Alex Rodriguez, so that's what we're going to do here. To be straightforward with you, I can't tell you anything about how A-Rod will perform in any level of sports executive positions, but I can project a little bit based on his playing career. Simply put, Alex Rodriguez is one of the most decorated individuals in baseball history. He's a 14-time All-Star, a 3-time MVP, and a World Series champion. A-Rod has achieved individual success as an athlete and clearly financially. Now let's get into the waterfall of negativity. Alex Rodriguez's legacy in the eyes of baseball faithful is tarnished by his juicing scandals. In 2009, it was reported that A-Rod tested positive for roids all the way back in 2003, and over a decade later, A-Rod was suspended for the entire 2014 season for his use of PEDs and his obstruction of the subsequent investigation. A-Rod was also much maligned by many of his teammates throughout the years, garnering the name A-Fraud. he has been often portrayed by his former teammates and by the media as arrogant and self-absorbed, and he has been mocked by many for his perceived collapses in the clutch. So while a lot of that may be speculation, a lot of that may be sour grapes, a lot of that may just be he played most of his career in the very toxic New York media market. For better or for worse, Alex Rodriguez is a polarizing figure in sports. And how that'll play out at an ownership level should at the very least be very intriguing. And hey, at least with Rodriguez and Lore, we should be able to retire Kevin Garnett's number. I really hope so. That's like the top of my personal list as to things we need to achieve with new ownership. The over 2-year buffer between now and the official change in ownership makes it difficult to assess what effect the transition will have on current staff members. Regardless of record, right now sentiment around Chris Finch is mostly positive, and it's clear that he's Gerson Rosa's coach of the future. It's not impossible to imagine him no longer being our coach by the point of transition. It's also not that hard to imagine him still being our coach, but frankly, what happens with any coach in an ownership change more so comes down to what happens with the GM. Now, at this exact moment in time, Ant Edwards' value is skyrocketing, D'Lo's return has been a thing of beauty, and the pieces are coming together for the Wolves of the future. So right now, sentiment around Gerson Rosas is mostly positive. His errors thus far have been of a forgivable nature, the failures of the team not necessarily to blame on him, so it's hard to imagine him being removed between right now and the transition of ownership. So it certainly appears that Rosas and most likely Finch will be around as the team changes hands, but the real intrigue is, will they be after? Owners operate on a very different level of involvement. Some owners like Marc Cuban and Steve Ballmer are deeply involved and emotionally invested, while other owners are men of mystery and are not often seen or heard from. Frankly, if A-Rod and Marc Lore are hands-on, it's hard to imagine Rosas sticking around. Not because of an apparent lack of quality, but transitions of this caliber typically see a major recalibration of the whole organization. Glen Taylor is not an overly involved owner, so a transition to a more hands-on ownership team would see a diminishment in Rosas' executive power. That could certainly cause tension between him and the new ownership, and they could look to install their own operative as the new GM. Simply put, when the GM goes, the coach goes too, so Finch would be lumped in with that. Now, if A-Rod and Lore are more hands-off and they're pleased with the work that Rosas is doing, he could certainly stick around, and hell, over this 2-year transition period, it's not hard to imagine that they would come to know each other and like each other, so maybe he would stick around that way. I personally like Rosas, and overall, I think we're moving in the right direction, but more clarity will come over that stuff in the next 2 years, and, a full reorganization with the removal of everybody involved might just be what the Wolves need anyways. Let's briefly dip into player contracts and the timeline that has with an ownership change. Of the current Timberwolves roster, Karl-Anthony Towns is the only player who's under contract at the beginning of the 2023-24 season. Ant Edwards, Malik Beasley, and Mac Daddy, yeah, goddamn right we're talking Mac Daddy in this video, all have team options through that season. D'Lo's contract comes up at the end of the previous season, so any type of extension, barring just letting go into free agency, will have already been decided at this point, and one has to imagine the new ownership will have quite a bit of say in what happens there. Now, as far as the players' direct relationship goes, Cat has been seen wearing Yankees gear throughout his tenure as a Timberwolf. Karl also recently shared a pretty emotional story about an A-Rod jersey and how much it meant to him. So the relationship between Karl and A-Rod has positive footing to build upon. And that's not necessarily the most relevant thing in the world, but it certainly can't hurt. And frankly, the face of the team having synergy with the owner of the team sure would be a welcomed sight after the whole Garnett-Taylor debacle. The most important takeaway from our contract timelines and the ownership transition is that the two most important pieces of our team as it stands right now, Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards, will still be under contract, meaning we won't be playing with an empty hand at the point of transition. All right, we can put it off no longer. We have to talk about relocation. All over Twitter and in every report about this prospective ownership change, the number one topic they addressed is relocation. Now, I will say it's been reported by The Athletic as well as Shams Charania that the negotiations were conducted between Taylor and the new ownership committee under the idea that the team would remain in Minnesota. Taylor was very clear in his search for a successor that keeping the team in Minnesota was a prerequisite. The issue is that infamously, Clay Bennett and his ownership committee purchased the Seattle Supersonics under the premise that there was no discussion of relocation, and they publicly stated that. Then less than a year later, Bennett would announce the team's intent to relocate to Oklahoma City. So unless it is in writing as part of the contract between A-Rod, Lore, and Glen Taylor, I wouldn't put too much into these promises, but not all hope is lost, however. The NBA owners would have to vote on an approval of relocation, and the Wolves leaving Minnesota to, say, Las Vegas or Seattle would mean vacating the 14th largest media market in the country. Minneapolis-St. Paul, it's a strong market, and leaving a fan base like this, well, it's not unimaginable, and we're not New York or Chicago. It would likely be under quite a bit of scrutiny and might not make it past the ownership committee votes. Adam Silver has also been quoted as saying that league expansion is inevitable. And while it doesn't appear to be in the immediate future, the league growing from 30 to 32 teams seems to be on the board for consideration in the foreseeable future. There is literally no way that one of those expansion teams wouldn't be in Seattle. So in terms of the Wolves relocating, that would obviously be the strongest market to take our team from us. Let's hope that they are just straight up off the board by the time that new ownership would even have the chance to move us. There are several expansion markets to consider, like Las Vegas and Tampa Bay or even Louisville. So the removal of just two strong markets doesn't completely neutralize the threat. It certainly helps because Minnesota is frankly a stronger market than most of the expansion markets. So if the top two expansion markets come off the board, we stand a pretty good chance of sticking around. And if we did relocate before expansion, we'd probably get an expansion team. So, I think it'll work out. I think there's going to be a basketball team in Minnesota, and I hope I don't eat those words. Like I said at the top of the video, I can only speculate and theorize, and I have no way of actually assessing what an ownership change is going to look like for Minnesota. But for the sake of the sanity of us Wolves fans, let's hope it inspires some positive change. And hey, if they do relocate, we'll be free to this prison, and we'll all get to go pick a new team. And unless you pick the Kings, you're going to be better off than if you were a Wolves fan. So you can look forward to that, I guess. Stay lit, and thanks for watching.